that exactly these three stages of practice also relate to these different stages. Of course, actually, you have to start where you know that there are these different stages of this essence of Sufi training: namaz, wazifa, zikr, and fikr. And to a certain extent, these are pure methodological elements. But of course, they are also part of the practices which one has to do. And to that extent, you could relate namaz, that means the attitude of prayer, to that first stage of fana fi shaykh. That is, prayer can be done in many different ways. You know, Murshid discusses that very extensively in the Unity of Religious Ideals. Particularly, I always recommend the last chapter of the first part of the Unity, which is on religion, and where Murshid, in that final chapter, gives a marvelous explanation of the psychological aspects of prayer. And first, prayer is developed in many different ways, as a psychology of gratitude, a psychology of trust, a psychology of fulfilling one's needs. Those three elements are there in the first stage of the prayer, and one has to merge into them. Of course, prayers are done in so many different ways, but of course, in mysticism, one has to make a reality of one's prayers. And that means that the psychological attunement has to be an effective part also of one's prayers. And when that element of mastery of prayer, the prayerful attitude, has been achieved, then there's a following stage which already Murshid, in which Murshid already describes the divine immanence. And in that particular chapter, Murshid mentioned the immanence of the divine presence, of the divine impulse in all nature. He said that the contemplation of nature is to be aware of that life which reaches out to you when you are in nature, in the beauty of nature, the beauty of a natural surrounding. Something comes to you. There's a wonderful chapter in the Rose Garden, The Silent Life, which describes that in further detail, where something of that divine life which pervades everything, which is present in everything as a very condition of its life, something reaches out to you. And that's from that kind of transcendent focus of the namaz, of the religious stage, the first stage, you get already to this mystical sense of the life which is all-pervading and of which you are a part, but which all nature is a part as well. Because in other contexts, Murshid does not only refer to nature, but also to beauty in a very general sense. And of course, all of you know that beauty is a key concept of Murshid's teachings, love, harmony, and beauty. And beauty is the very focus on the essence of life. And so there this is exactly what one has to reach in that following stage. Now, that following stage of focusing on nature, focusing on the immanence of divine impulse in everything that exists as the very condition of its life. Now, that in the matters of practice relates precisely to that stage of the wazifa. Of course, wazifa can be done in many different ways. You can do it in a religious way, in the horizontal way. You can try to do it in the mystical way, in the vertical way. And that, of course, means that the fulfillment of wazifa is, very often people interpret the wazifa as a prayer, an additional prayer, an appeal to God. And that's perfectly legitimate if it gives the people their own fulfillment. But at the same time, there should be that awareness in mysticism that element of the wazifa, which is a name of God, one of the Asma al-Husna, one of the most beautiful names of God, which inherently has a sparkle of that immanence in the life of your soul. In other words, being your own essence. That means to say that your sense of existence, your sense of being, is, for the time that you do this practice, fully focused on that element, that the reality of your being, when we are doing the zikr, is the identification with that divine name which the zikr expresses. Now, of course, the divine name itself, as I always say, you've heard me say that before, is something like a wireless receiver or indeed a television set. It transmits something. It's not in itself that very thing, but it is something which transmits, something which symbolizes something. And so there you have that concept to identify with something, to become a receiver yourself, to become that wireless set yourself, the television. So you receive that which is meant to transmit. Now, that is the idea, again, of the wazifa. Then the zikr, which again can be done in many different ways. People do zikr in a purely religious way to testify that there is one divine reality and no other deities or no other realities as such. But that's purely religious. When you go into mysticism, then again it is that the one existence beyond which there is ultimately no other existence but that which gives existence to everything else is that divine essence. And so that is the further step of the zikr. Again, like every of the previous exercises as well, there are always different stages in which you can practice them. You may start as a religious stage, but go on. Don't get your feet nailed down on the religious stage on the horizontal level. Go on to the vertical level. Don't stand as Moshe Nathan says, keep standing on the one step of the staircase. A staircase is to be mounted. It's not to take a stand on it. You proceed through it. And so there again, that's zikr, and its ultimate reality, and what is what we aim at in mysticism, is precisely that denial of everything else but the Zat Ilahi, the divine essence, no longer through, as I say, the wireless set of the divine name, or no longer but that stage of the wazifa, but beyond the divine names is the divine essence. That's one of the essential concepts in mysticism. Beyond the attributes of God by which we can typify, characterize God in a particular aspect corresponding to our particular need. Beyond that, there is that aspect of divine reality as such, beyond our needs and yet the fulfillment of all our needs. And so that is the way one has to grow into this concept of the zikr. La ilaha illallah, nothing exists really except that ultimate divine impulse, which is the essence of everything that exists, and therefore the fulfillment of everything that exists is to re-establish that link, to realize that basic unity and that essential being, which at the same time is the immortal being inherent in every human being and in everything that lives. So that is the fulfillment of the wazifa. Then, of course, ultimately, well, not ultimately, but still as a fulfilling element of this whole process of namaz, wazifa, zikr, you come to fikr, which generally is done on the breath, inhaling and exhaling. And there, very often, one again takes up one of the divine names. It can also be either the zikr or one of the wazifas can be practiced on the breath. And you know how greatly, especially in Indian mysticism, how extremely important that element of breath is. Well, all of us, we know it. We couldn't do without breath for a few minutes. It has to go on. So that element is so very important that it is very important to carry it on in one's mystical development in all the different ways and elaborate it for it. And so there it is, you're no longer, as you would in the wazifa, when you appeal, the wazifa still has that element of appeal, of the I, thou. I try to overcome the I, thou, I try to, so to speak, to become that particular attribute which I'm focusing on. But that's the approach. Then with fikr, that fourth stage, it's no longer an appeal, it is an expression. so to speak, as from that divine realization inherent in that particular attribute, you express it, you give it reality in your outer consciousness, and thereby in your life as it is in the world. So one is absorbing into it, the other expressing from it. And correspondingly, you know that when you do a fikr, you do not say Ya Rahman or Ya Rahim or any of so, but you omit that Ya, which is a vocative, an appeal, and that is what you omit. That is, without that appeal, it is the expression which you give as from your inner being of that particular element. That is when you use the fikr with a wazifa. And then beyond that is the fikr used as zikr, and that then you turn it around. You all know that, I've said it many times. You're inhaling Allahu, exhaling La ilaha illallah. So that Allah, when you inhale, at the same time you have this conception that you draw into your consciousness that soul illumination which is in the depth of you and which you are not conscious of. Drawing in the breath, drawing in from inside that illuminative element which is hidden in your own inner being. And then La ilaha illallah, that means realization, express the realization that is your real reality. That is the reality of your being. And at the same time, that reality is expressed in everything that lives and everything that is in this manifestation, a living element. Allahu La ilaha illallah. So that again, indeed, corresponds, as the questioner asked, it corresponds to that idea of the Fana Baqa process. I've taken a long time to answer one question. I hope I met the question. Let me say that when I have answered the question, the people who asked the question have forgotten what the question was. But anyway, I hope this is somewhat clear. If not, you're very welcome to come back to it. So indeed, these 4 stages of the Trifana and the Baqa correspond to these 4 stages of our practices. Of course, there are the other practices, which are more, let us say, particular specialism in a particular direction. They are typically Indian practices also. But these 4 really are the basics of the Sufi practices and the theories and the philosophies that surround them.